Hey guys, welcome to the Steroid series part 4. Today we are going to create the world's most powerful anabolic steroid. But a really quick overview on the series so far. We have spoken about the androgen receptor, how steroids bind to the androgen receptor. We've spoken about how testosterone is a 4-ring structure with 19 carbons, 28 hydrogen atoms, and 2 oxygen atoms. We've spoken about how steroids can be anabolic or androgenic, anabolic being pure muscle mass, and androgenic being all the other effects apart from muscle mass. And we've spoken about how steroids can bind either strongly, intermediately, or weakly to the androgen receptor to increase our muscle mass. And keep in mind today that a methyl group is 1 carbon surrounded by 3 hydrogen atoms, and that is a molecule we're going to speak about a lot. Okay, let's get into it. Let's create the world's most powerful anabolic steroid. We have 2 main considerations for today to create a steroid that is super powerful. That is, we need to make sure it binds very strongly to the androgen receptor. And secondly, we need to make sure it is more anabolic than it is androgenic. In other words, to make the world's most powerful steroid today, we need to make a steroid that binds and does not give up the binding spot on the androgen receptor to increase muscle mass. And we also need to remove all the androgenic effects and make it purely anabolic. So we have 3 main aspects we're going to cover. Firstly, the androgen receptor, how we make it bind strongly. Secondly, how do we remove androgenic properties? And thirdly, how do we boost anabolic properties of our steroid? So firstly, how do we make it bind strongly to the androgen receptor? Well, firstly, the oxygen atom at carbon position 3 is a key part of a steroid that creates its binding affinity to the androgen receptor. In fact, removing this significantly reduces the binding of a steroid to the receptor by up to 5 times. So we are keeping this oxygen atom as it is. That one stays. Secondly, we want to keep the 11th carbon free from oxygen because putting anything in this 11th carbon position significantly reduces the binding affinity of the steroid. Thirdly, adding a methyl group at carbon position 7 significantly increases binding affinity, so let's add one in there. Fourthly, removing the C19, which is carbon 19 position methyl group, significantly increases binding affinity again, so let's remove that one. That one is out of here. Let's get rid of it. And discussed in part 3, the flatter a steroid molecule is, the more easily it can slip into that androgen receptor pocket and stay in there bound and significantly increasing muscle mass. So how do we make a steroid more flat? Well, we're going to add double bonds all the way up the steroidal backbone in rings A, B, and C to flatten the molecule. Alright, with binding taken care of, we are now going to move on to androgenic properties. How do we remove or reduce the androgenic effects of our steroid? So completely removing the oxygen to hydrogen group at the 17th carbon eliminates all androgenic activity. And you would be thinking, why don't we just get rid of it completely? Well, it would be really nice, but we need it for binding. That group is very important for binding to the androgen receptor, so it's a bit of a trade-off here. In fact, removing that group weakens the ability of a steroid to bind to the androgen receptor by 190 times. So you can see we need to keep this group in order to give our new steroid a chance at binding to the receptor. So while it would be nice to get rid of this is a trade-off. We're going to have to keep this one in, and therefore it is on the team just. The double bond between carbons 4 and 5, this one is staying in because removing this significantly increases androgenic activity. As we know, DHT, which is much more androgenic than testosterone, has no double bond between carbons 4 and 5. So we don't want this. We actually want to keep the double bond at carbons 4 and 5 in. So that one is staying on the team. Now, as spoken about in the binding section, we know that removing the methyl group at C19, which is carbon 19 position, significantly increases binding, but it also removes androgenic activity. So that is a double whammy. And thankfully we got rid of that one. So that one is gone. All right, with androgenic activity done, we are now moving on to anabolic effects. How do we boost up the anabolic activity of this steroid hugely? We want to make this the most anabolic, most disgusting steroid we have ever known on this planet. How do we do that? Firstly, modifying the A ring to add a huge another carbon ring out the front of it actually increases anabolic activity, but it's not very useful because that huge ring doesn't bind very well into the androgen receptor. So whilst it would increase anabolic activity, it doesn't actually bind very well, so we can't have that. Drugs that do that are things like stanozolol, which is actually quite anabolic, but you need a lot of it because one stanozolol molecule doesn't bind very well into the receptor pocket. However, what we can do is we can add an oxygen molecule at the C2 position, and drugs that do this are things like oxandrolone, and that has been shown to increase anabolic activity of the steroid. However, it's not actually required when there's a double bond between carbons 4 and 5. We already have a double bond between carbons 4 and 5, so we don't really need to worry about this. We move on to point number 2, which is a double bond between carbons 1 and 2 really boosts up anabolic activity, again by making the steroid more flat. Let's chuck in a double bond here. Adding a methyl group at the C17 position. Okay, this is the most important thing we can do to a steroid. Adding a methyl group at the C17 position is huge in what it can do for a steroid. It makes it more orally active, so it can be taken by mouth. It makes the liver unable to break it down as quickly, so it really prolongs the anabolic effect hugely, and the amount of muscle mass you can gain on C17 alkylated steroids is huge. We are going to throw in an alkylated group at C17 or a methyl group, and we are going to make this steroid orally active and absolutely devastatingly potent. Not only this, but adding a methyl group at the C17 position prevents the steroid from being aromatized to estrogen, and we are just increasing the anabolic activity even more because it can't be converted to estrogen. Fourthly, we can add an oxygen to hydrogen group at carbon position 4. This increases anabolic activity by about 6.9, so about 7 times. Let's throw that in because that is very potent. The fifth point is, as mentioned earlier, adding a methyl group at carbon position 7 not only increases binding, but it actually does boost the anabolic activity directly up to even 1,000 times more anabolic. So we're going to throw in a methyl group at C7. And the reason for this is because adding a methyl group here makes our steroid more flat again when you're looking at it from a side view. And also a methyl group here stops 5-alpha reductase from converting anything to DHT. Now, DHT is very androgenic, and when the conversion is stopped, that means that the anabolic potency is driven up much more. And for some reason, a methyl group here seems to stop the ability of the 5-alpha reductase enzyme to work properly. So we are not getting that conversion to DHT. I mean, this steroid is starting to become scary as to how powerful it is with the small chemical modifications we are making. So in summary, what have we done to this steroid? And really, what have I done here? I feel like Frankenstein, I've created this monster. What have we done? The summary is we have kept a C3 oxygen for binding. We've kept the 11th carbon molecule free from oxygen for binding. We've added a methyl group at carbon position 7. We've removed the carbon 19 methyl group. We added double bonds all the way up the backbone to make the entire molecule flatter and more anabolic. We added a double bond from carbons 1 to 2. The most important part, we added a methyl group at C17, which makes it orally active and increases anabolic activity hugely. And we added an OH group, oxygen to hydrogen group, at carbon position 4 for anabolic activity. What have I done here? I have created a monster. This is likely the world's most powerful steroid. This thing is so anabolic, it is not funny, and it would bind to the androgen receptor with so much affinity. It would be latched on like an alligator and not give up that binding site at all. This is scary what I have created, and I honestly feel like Frankenstein. I have created this monster, but it is all for your education, guys, because it is so interesting that small structural modifications to a molecule that you may not think on a steroid molecule would do much completely change the characteristics and the personality of how that steroid behaves in your system. But it's all for education, just to show you how powerful steroids can be with these small structural modifications. And guess what? You guys out there, you get to name this thing. I've created it and it's all for education. Please do not go and do this or try and create this thing by any circumstances, because yeah, it would probably kill you, this thing, pretty quickly. And in terms of liver toxicity, it would be devastating in every single aspect. So anyway, you guys get to name this thing. So the comment with the most amount of likes, you will have a part in naming potentially the world's most powerful steroid. Thank you so much for coming along for the ride. We have created something here. It's scary. I feel disgusted that I've created something so powerful, but yeah, it's been fun anyway. And I thank you so much for coming along for the ride. Part 4, 5, 6, 7, and onwards are all coming out. We're now moving into how steroids behave in your body. And I really appreciate all the support on this series, which is the steroid series. I look forward to seeing you in part 5 soon, guys. Thank you. Fitness Science signing out.